The hallway outside the ICU felt colder than December. Fluorescent lights hummed in the ceiling, a thin white noise that had replaced the rhythm of her son's laughter months ago. Julia Bennett sat in the molded plastic chair beside his bed, her fingers laced around a small wooden cross that had long since lost its shine. The cross had belonged to her husband, gone 3 years now, and every time she closed her hand around it, the edges still found ways to cut. Machines blinked beside her like city lights on a dying street. The monitor traced out her son's heartbeat in green, a fragile mountain range that rose and fell too slowly. The clock on the wall whispered the same number again and again, 3:33 a.m. Outside the window, rain was falling in fine silver threads. It painted the glass with trembling veins, turning the parking lot lamps into halos that bled light. Julia pressed her forehead to the cool pane and whispered, "Just breathe, baby, please." Her voice cracked against the glass and disappeared. They said he should have woken by now. They said swelling in the brain can take away more than it gives back. They said a lot of things that began with, "We're sorry." She hated that phrase. It always meant someone had given up. Julia hadn't slept in 43 hours. Coffee cups ringed the counter like votive candles to a god she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. She used to believe. She used to pray over breakfast, to sing hymns while folding laundry. She used to tell her husband, "Faith is just remembering who's driving when the fog gets thick," but the fog had never cleared after his accident. And now she was the one behind the wheel, blind, trembling, lost. The nurse on duty peeked through the glass window in the ICU door, the way people glance at storms from safe rooms. "Mrs. Bennett," she said softly, stepping in, "you should rest." "We've got him," Julia shook her head. "If he wakes up and I'm asleep, what kind of mother would I be?" The nurse offered a gentle smile that didn't reach her eyes. "A human one." Then she slipped out again, the door sighing shut. Julia turned back to her boy. His name was Evan. He had freckles across the bridge of his nose, same as his father, and a small scar under his chin from the time he tried to race the neighbor's dog. He'd wanted to be an astronaut once, then a firefighter, then whatever helps people. Now he lay weightless under tubes and wires, and she couldn't help anyone at all. She reached for his hand. It was warm, thank God, still warm, though the IV line made his skin feel less like a child's and more like a promise slipping. "I'd trade everything," she whispered. "Every day left. Just let him open his eyes." A thunder of silence answered her. Julia's gaze drifted to the clock again. 3:33. Funny, she thought, how numbers could look like prayers you don't understand, back when she still went to church. The pastor once said that 3 was the number of completion, the Father, the Son, the Spirit. 3 together meant wholeness. But 3:33 felt cruelly incomplete, like a chord missing its last note. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from her sister in Ohio, still awake. "We're praying, love you." Julia typed back, "Don't, just rest. I'll call if anything changes." Then she deleted it, set the phone face down, and stared at the blinking lights. Minutes melted. The world outside became a watercolor blur. She started to hum, an old lullaby she hadn't sung since Evan was small. Her voice shook on the high notes, and for a heartbeat she imagined his fingers twitching in rhythm. But it was only her own pulse echoing through her wrist. She leaned back, exhaustion finally prying at her eyes. The hum of oxygen, the drip of IV, the faint hiss of rain, they braided together like a cradle song. Her head tilted forward. The cross slipped from her grasp and landed softly on the linoleum. Sleep, when it came, was not kind. She dreamt of water, of standing in the middle of a lake with fog curling around her knees. Somewhere beyond the mist, a voice was calling. Low, steady, familiar. Julia, she turned. The fog parted for a moment, revealing a figure standing on the far shore. She couldn't see the face, only the light behind it. "Julia," the voice said again. "He's not alone." She woke with a start. For a second she thought she'd imagined it. The room was still, except for the steady pulse of machines. Then something brushed her shoulder, gentle, definite, warm. She gasped, spinning around. No one. Her heart pounded so loud she was sure it would wake the entire ward. "Hello?" she whispered. Her breath fogged the air in front of her. Nothing. Then the monitor beeped faster. Just a flicker, a single spike higher than before. Julia froze. Evan? His fingers twitched. Barely, but she saw it. Tears rushed to her eyes, uninvited, uncontrollable. She stumbled forward, pressing both hands around his. Hey, I'm here. I'm here, sweetheart. The monitor steadied. The room seemed to exhale. Julia looked around again, still half expecting a nurse, a doctor, someone to explain the impossible. But the hallway beyond the glass was empty, the nurse's station dark. Her eyes fell to the cross lying near her shoe. She picked it up. The wood felt warmer than before. Outside, lightning flashed once, illuminating the rain into 1,000 silver spears, and for the briefest instant reflected in the glass. Julia thought she saw a figure standing beside her, a man in white, hand resting on her shoulder. When the light faded, she was alone again. The clock read 3:34 a.m. Julia sank to her knees. Not from fear, but from something heavier, something holy. The floor was cold, but her chest burned with a strange, quiet fire. Was that you? She whispered. Was that real? No thunder answered, no wind. Only the sound of her own breath and the steady rhythm of her son's heart. Stronger now, clearer. She pressed the cross to her lips, eyes closed. For the first time in years, her prayer had no words, only gratitude, only tears. And outside, unseen behind the fogged glass, the rain slowed to a hush, as if the night itself had paused to listen. The hospital had a way of turning time into water, slipping, pooling, refusing to move the way you wanted. Even after the clock crawled past 3:34, even after the monitor's green line steadied like a resilient pulse, the night didn't loosen its grip. It hovered, a weight on Julia's shoulders, an ache in the space between breaths. She stood, wiped her face with the corner of her sleeve, and pressed the call button. Could someone just check him? Her voice surprised her. It was small but not broken, like a violin string tuned one note up from snapping. The nurse from before, round glasses, a long braid, a badge flashing Melissa, slid through the door with practiced quiet. She scanned the screen, her eyes flicking to the numbers, to Evan, to Julia. Vitals look good. A beat. Better, actually. Something happened, Julia whispered. She didn't say the rest, and I don't know if it was a dream or God, or the kind of mercy you only recognize after it passes through you. Melissa nodded the way nurses nod when they've been taught never to argue with hope. Let me page the night resident. She placed a warm hand on Julia's forearm, human, steady. You should drink some water. When the door shut again, the room settled back into its layered hush, oxygen humming, rain resting, lights humming like a distant choir with no words. Julia reached for the styrofoam cup, took one sip and put it down. The water tasted like pennies. Her tongue still remembered. Salt. She dragged the chair closer to the bed and studied her boy's face the way she used to study. Report cards and x-rays, and the fine print on insurance. Forms, searching for the sentence that would set her free. His eyelashes lay peaceful against his cheeks. The IV beeped once, politely, and then apologized in silence. Do you remember your dad's corny camping songs? She asked him. The ones with 5 chords and no tune. A laugh escaped her, fragile and genuine. You were the only one who clapped on beat, memory unspooled. It didn't ask permission. The last summer before everything broke, they drove north just to chase a meteor shower. Evan fell asleep with chocolate on his mouth, and her husband, Matt, sat beside her on the truck's tailgate, counting streaks of light and naming them out loud, like blessings. One for your mom, one for the mortgage, one for the dog finally learning not to jump the fence. He died in October. Not dramatic, not cinematic. A single skid on black ice, a guardrail, a folded flag from a volunteer fire department. What faith survives the kind of paperwork grief demands? What prayer fits in the margins of death certificates and casserole schedules and the way a house sounds when you turn off the television because there's nobody to laugh at? For a while she tried. She made it to church on Sundays until the pew started to feel like a dare. Everyone sang around her, their mouths opening in perfect O's. and the words tasted like chalk in her throat. People hugged her too long. People didn't hug her at all. People delivered advice tied up with scripture like a ribbon on a bandage. He's in a better place. God never gives you more than you can handle. She learned to smile with half her face. She learned to fold bulletins into cranes. She learned to take communion without closing her eyes. When Evan was hit 8 months ago, an intersection that should have been clear, a driver who'd worked the night shift and blinked at the wrong moment, the world tipped a few degrees and nothing ever sat right again. The ER lights were the same shade of winter as the ones above her now. The doctor's mouth said stable, but his hand said fragile. Julia clung to whatever grammar of hope still lived in her palms. 4 days into the ICU, the pastor from their old church found her number. He brought a plant. The soil smelled like a promise she couldn't make. "We're with you," he said, and left a psalm on the tray table. That night she tore the page out, not because she hated God, but because the words kept knocking on the door of a house where nobody lived anymore. She didn't stop believing in God exactly. She stopped believing in the version of him she could manage, the one she could bribe with good behavior, the one who sent sunshine to the righteous and lightning to the careless. She had been both righteous and careless. The sky had not consulted her either way. And yet there was the touch, the warmth, the syllables that had threaded the dream and the waking with the same voice. "He's not alone. I have been so angry," she said aloud, startling at how ordinary fury sounded among machines. "I have been angry at you, at traffic lights, at snow, at the way grief makes grocery stores feel like cathedrals." She leaned forward, forehead nearly touching the blanket. "I've been angry at myself for outliving him, for letting exhaustion make me difficult to love, for teaching my son how to be brave without remembering to teach him how to be small." The resident came and went. Kind eyes, efficient penlight, a promise to adjust meds by the hour and keep watching the numbers like shepherds watching stars. When he left, the room returned to its faithful liturgy of beeps. A long ribbon of night stretched out behind her, and for the first time she felt the urge to name it. "I was lost." 2 words, too simple to hold so much geography. Still, they made a map in her mouth. She picked up the cross again. It had belonged to Matt since youth group camp, carved by a counselor who told every kid the same story, that wood remembers hands, that splinters can become homilies if you're patient. During the funeral, she had hidden it in her coat pocket, too ashamed to hold it in public, too stubborn to put it down. "What if I didn't stop believing?" she murmured, "but I stopped answering." The confession landed like a coin in holy water, a small, clean sound. She thought of all the bargains she'd tried to make in the last months. "I'll give you Sundays. I'll give you meatless Fridays. I'll even give up those shows everyone says are bad for my soul." She stopped when she realized every sentence began with "I'll give you" and none began with "you are." There are prayers that are transactions and prayers that are surrender. She had been too tired to notice the difference. On the whiteboard, a nurse had drawn a smiley face beside the day's goals, as if optimism were a medication they could dose. "Under today we hope for." Someone had written "Rest Stable ICP, one small sign." Julia stared at the words until they blurred, then sharpened again. One small sign. She hadn't asked heaven for a sign in years. The last time she did, a gust of wind had slammed a church door, and everyone laughed and said, "Look, God speaks fluent slapstick." She didn't need slapstick. She needed something that could sit on her chest without breaking the ribs beneath. Her phone buzzed again. This time she let it light the room. A message from a number she didn't recognize. "If you're weary, come as you are. The chapel's open." No signature, no emoji, just the simple mercy of an unlocked door. She stood, half ready to go, then stopped. How do you leave a sleeping child who might be waking? How do you walk toward God when you're afraid he might be standing in the doorway? She placed the phone face down and reached for Evan's hair. "You always hated gel," she whispered, smoothing a curl. "You said it made your head feel like a helmet," she smiled. "You still look like your dad when you sleep." The room cooled. A colder, cleaner, the way air feels right after someone opens a window in a house that's been shut all winter. She looked around again. No one had come in. No door had opened. "You can be angry and still be held," she heard herself say, not sure whether she spoke to Evan or the air. "You can be wrong and still be wanted." The truths felt too big for her throat, but they balanced there anyway. She gathered the blanket around his shoulders and sat back. Her body ached with small mortal complaints, hips sore from the chair, neck stiff from the angle of prayer human beings invent when they forget how to kneel. She let the ache be what it was. Pain had taught her many languages. Tonight it translated into presence. Rain ticked softly on the glass. The clock moved, 3:41, 3:47, each minute a bead on a rosary. She didn't know how to pray anymore. She decided to pray with breath instead. In on mercy. Out on fear. In on mercy. Out on fear. After a while, the words dropped away, and only the rhythm remained. A custodian wheeled a mop past the door, humming something that might have been a hymn if you tilted your head. Julia smiled at the sound and pictured the mop water turning the hallway into a river that carried every sharp-edged thought downstream. She reached for the psalm the pastor had left weeks ago, the page she'd torn, the one she told herself she resented. It was still folded under the tray, a little wrinkled, a little stubborn. She smoothed it open with both palms. "Even if I make my bed in the depths, you are there." She didn't cry this time. She didn't feel fireworks or trumpets. She felt a simple, improbable relief, like finding a light switch in a room you've been navigating with your hands outstretched. "Okay," she whispered, eyes on the verse like it might run away. "If you're there, then I'm here." It wasn't surrender. Not yet, but it wasn't a bargain either. It was attendance. It was roll call answered from the back of the classroom. Evan's chest rose fell. The green line held. Somewhere in the building, a monitor chirped a cheerful melody because a baby had been born. Life does that, sings indecently close to the wounded. Julia closed her eyes. She thought of the chapel, of the text, of the nameless invitation. She thought of a touch on her shoulder that didn't have fingerprints but left warmth anyway. She didn't know if she would leave the room tonight, but for the first time in a long time, she knew she could. That corridor existed. That door was real. Possibility returned like circulation to a numb hand. She leaned in, lips near Evan's ear. "If you're following a light," she murmured, the way you murmur to sleepers and saints, "I'm following it with you." The night didn't end. Not yet, it loosened. A seam somewhere gave way. Through it, a draft of something like morning slipped in and stayed. The chapel and the quiet by dawn, the hospital had changed color. The rain had drained away, leaving the windows glazed with faint light, the color of milk, not sunrise. Julia blinked against it, realizing she hadn't really slept, only drifted somewhere between prayer and survival. Her back throbbed from the chair. Her throat ached from whispering things she'd never planned to say aloud. The text on her phone still waited like an unopened door. "If you're weary, come as you are. The chapel's open." She looked at Evan again. The steady pulse of the monitor still kept time, and for the first time in months, his breathing wasn't shallow. It was enough. She whispered, "I'll be right back," then hesitated, half expecting the machines to protest. They didn't. Outside the ICU, the corridor smelled of antiseptic and coffee. Nurses pushed carts past her, murmuring in the coded shorthand of the sleep-deprived. Somewhere a baby cried. Somewhere else, laughter cracked through like a sunbeam that didn't know it was trespassing. Life was moving again, and Julia felt clumsy keeping pace. She followed the signs. Chapel, lower level. The elevator doors opened with a sigh, exhaling the scent of metal and old fabric. She stepped inside, pressing B, her finger trembling slightly. In the mirrored wall, she barely recognized herself, eyes swollen, hair pulled back in something that used to be a braid, lips pale. She looked like every parent who'd ever spent the night bargaining with heaven. When the doors parted, the hallway was empty, just her and the low hum of vents. The chapel door stood slightly ajar. A warm amber light spilled through the crack. She hesitated before pushing it open. The space was small. No stained glass, no choir loft, only a wooden cross at the front and rows of chairs too simple to be pews. A single candle flickered near the altar, its flame bending and steadying again, like it was breathing with her. No one else was there. Julia stepped inside, and the air changed. It wasn't colder or warmer, but different, as if the air itself remembered what silence was for. She sat in the last row. The cushion hissed softly beneath her. Her eyes found the cross, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like an accusation. It just was. "I don't know how to talk to you anymore," she whispered. "Not without sounding like I'm still mad." Her voice faded, swallowed by the stillness. She waited. Nothing moved. Then, somewhere near the altar, a sound. Not a word, just a shift, like someone had leaned forward in their chair. Julia straightened. "Hello?" A man stepped from the shadow between the front pews. His coat was pale, his hands tucked gently into the pockets. His face wasn't remarkable, ordinary in the way a sunrise is ordinary once you stop taking it for granted. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said. His voice carried the same quiet warmth that had brushed her shoulder hours earlier. Julia's breath hitched. You work here?" He smiled faintly. "Sometimes." She wanted to ask what that meant, but something about his calm disarmed her. Did you send that message?" "I opened the door," he said. "You walked through it." Her fingers tightened around the cross in her palm. "You sound like a pastor." "I'm not." He took a few steps closer, stopping at the end of the aisle. "But I do listen," Julia's heart stuttered. There it was, the same phrasing, the same cadence she had heard in the dark. "You've been angry at me for too long." The chapel seemed to shrink around them. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer. He just tilted his head. "Why are you here?" "I don't know anymore," she said, voice trembling. My husband's gone. My son's half gone. I'm tired of pretending to believe in things that don't answer." He nodded, as if she'd recited something familiar. "You think silence means absence, doesn't it?" She snapped. "How long am I supposed to keep talking to a wall?" "Until you realize the echo is a reply," he said. Julia sank back against the chair, tears welling. "I can't do this. I can't be the kind of person who calls tragedy a blessing." "I didn't ask you to," he said gently. "I asked you to remember that love didn't leave when the light did." The words landed like stones sinking into deep water. Her shoulders began to shake. "Why him? Why my family?" The man's gaze was steady, not pitying. "Because love doesn't choose where it hurts. It only chooses to stay." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The candle flame bent low, then straightened again. Finally, Julia whispered, "Was that you?" "Last night." His smile barely moved, but something in it glowed. "You were never alone." A sob escaped before she could stop it. She covered her face with both hands, the cross digging into her palms. He didn't come closer, didn't touch her. He simply stood there, the way light stands in a room without asking permission. After a while, she heard him say, "You can't carry what was never yours to fix." She lifted her head. "What do I do then?" "Start with what you still have. Breathe. Forgive yourself for surviving." The words broke her open in a way grief never could. She had survived, but she'd never forgiven herself for it. Every heartbeat since the crash had felt like theft. When she finally looked up, the man was gone. The candle still burned, and beside it on the altar lay a folded napkin from the hospital cafeteria. 3 words were written in neat, sure handwriting. "He's not alone." Julia pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. She laughed, a sound half disbelief, half relief. The flame flickered brighter, as if laughing too. When she returned to the ICU, the corridor lights had softened into morning. Through the window, the first strip of gold stretched across the horizon. She paused outside her son's room, watching the slow, even rise of his chest. He was still sleeping, but the color had returned to his face, faint as dawn. Julia sank into the chair and let out a breath that felt like it had waited years to escape. She didn't know what had happened in the chapel. She didn't need to. All she knew was that for the first time since the world went quiet, she could hear herself whisper again, not in anger, not in fear, but in faith. "Okay," she said softly. "I believe you're still here, outside." The morning sun spilled through the window, catching on the edge of her cross and scattering its light across her son's blanket, tiny golden stars blooming in the silence. That night the sky was clear for the first time in weeks. Through the hospital windows, stars blinked above the city like someone had finally remembered to turn them on again. Julia sat by her son's bedside, fingers tracing the folded napkin she'd found in the chapel earlier that morning. 3 words stared back at her. He's not alone. She had read them 100 times. Each time they sounded less like comfort and more like a question. Was I? Evan slept peacefully, the slow, even rhythm of his breath blending with the muted sounds of machines. The nurses had dimmed the lights. Somewhere down the hallway, someone laughed, and the sound, small, human, made Julia smile. For a moment she almost forgot where she was. Almost. Then she looked at her son's hand, pale against the sheets, and the weight of every unspoken word came rushing back. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, eyes on the floor. The cross hung loosely between her fingers. "I don't know how to say this," she whispered. "But I think you already know," silence answered. "Not the kind that ignores, but the kind that listens. I hated you," she said finally. The words trembled out like glass. "I hated you for taking Matt, for letting my boy end up here. I said you were cruel. I said you were gone. And when you didn't answer, I decided that meant I was right." Her throat closed. The monitors kept steady time, but the truth is, I wasn't angry because you left. I was angry because you didn't leave me. You stayed. You kept showing up, in the way people helped, in the way someone always called right before I gave up. And I couldn't stand it. Because if you were still there, then I had to admit I wasn't done. Her voice cracked into a laugh that wasn't quite laughter. "Do you know how hard it is to hate someone who keeps forgiving you?" She wiped her eyes, shaking her head. "I'm tired of pretending I don't miss you." Outside, wind moved through the trees. The faint rustle echoed through the vent, sounding almost like breath. Julia closed her eyes, and in that thin, trembling space between exhaustion and prayer, she heard it again, a voice that wasn't quite sound, but wasn't silence either. "You were never meant to carry it alone." Her breath caught. "I can't let it go," she said. The guilt. The what-ifs. The night he called me and I didn't pick up. The last fight. The way I said 5 more minutes instead of, "I love you. It's all still here." "Grace isn't about erasing," the voice replied. "It's about rewriting what remains." She pressed her forehead to the blanket, tears hot on her cheeks. "I don't deserve rewriting." "No one does," came the gentle reply. "That's why it's grace." Julia's chest shook. For years, she had imagined God as thunder, as fire, as something too loud for the human heart to bear. But this voice, this presence was quiet enough to fit inside her breath. "Why me?" she whispered. "Why now?" "Because the moment you stopped pretending not to hear me was the moment you were ready to listen." The answer undid her. She clutched the cross to her heart and wept. Not the sharp, frantic sobs of grief, but the slow, cleansing kind that rinses dust off old stones. Minutes passed, or hours. She couldn't tell. When the voice returned, it wasn't in her ears. It was in the rhythm of the room, in the rise and fall of Evan's chest, in the faint hum of the monitors, faithful and alive. "Forgive yourself, Julia." Her head lifted. "For what?" "For surviving. For believing pain meant punishment. For calling the wilderness home." Her fingers curled tighter around the cross. "I don't know how. Start by remembering you were loved before you broke." The words sank into her like light through water. Julia closed her eyes. Behind them, she saw not memories but moments. Matt's hands covered in motor oil, Evan chasing fireflies, laughter echoing through a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon. None of it erased the pain, but somehow pain and love stood side by side, no longer enemies. She breathed out slowly. "I forgive me," she said, voice shaking. "Not because I earned it. Because I need to live again." Something shifted in the air, soft, invisible, holy. The monitors didn't spike. No miracle fireworks lit the room. But the heaviness that had pressed on her chest for years simply lifted. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't in control anymore. Julia leaned back in the chair. Her body felt empty and full all at once. She stared at her son's sleeping face and whispered, "You're not alone." "Neither am I." The words felt truer than anything she had said in years. A soft knock on the glass startled her. Nurse Melissa peeked in, carrying a clipboard. "Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. She paused, eyes on the monitor. "Oh, his oxygen levels are up again." That's really good." Julia smiled through the tears, still drying on her cheeks. "He's a fighter." Melissa nodded, adjusting a dial. "So are you." She hesitated, then said quietly, "You know, I don't usually say this, but 3:33. That's the time he stabilized this morning." Julia blinked. "How do you know that?" Melissa smiled. "I checked his chart. I liked numbers." "Funny coincidence, huh?" Julia looked at the napkin again, its edges smudged from her fingers. "He's not alone." "Yeah," she whispered. "Funny." When the nurse left, Julia stood and walked to the window. The city below shimmered with streetlights in motion, 100,000 small, imperfect miracles unfolding at once. Somewhere in that tangle of light, she thought, someone else was praying a desperate prayer, just like hers, and maybe, just maybe, someone was listening. She turned back toward her son, and for the first time since the accident, she didn't see a victim of tragedy. She saw a survivor of grace. She pressed a hand over her heart, feeling the steady beat beneath her ribs. "I'm still here." The room seemed to breathe with her. Outside, a single star pulsed through the thin veil of clouds, bright, persistent, unwavering. It wasn't the kind of miracle people wrote books about. It was smaller, quieter, the kind that chooses to shine exactly when you need, reminding that night isn't forever. Julia smiled, whispering into the stillness, "If you can hear me, thank you. For not giving up on me when I already had." The air shimmered once, faint and warm. Then the quiet settled again. Not empty, but alive. The kind of quiet that holds its breath because something holy has passed through. Morning arrived the way mercy does. Quietly, like it had been waiting outside the door all night and finally decided to come in. The city below wore a thin gold edge. Dust in the ICU air turned to glitter. Julia rubbed her eyes, surprised to find the skin beneath them less swollen, as if the room had slept for her. Evan's monitors kept their gentle metronome. His color was better today. No one would call it rosy, but the gray had retreated, as if dawn had negotiated a truce. Julia smoothed his blanket and touched the curl at his temple. "Still here," she said softly. "Both of us." Nurse Melissa slipped in with a clipboard and a steam of coffee. "Morning," she whispered. "Numbers held through the night. I'd say that's a win." "A win," Julia repeated, tasting the word like new bread. I forgot how it felt. Melissa glanced at the tray table. "Do you want anything from downstairs?" "You should eat." "I will," Julia said, surprising herself by meaning it. 5 minutes. When Melissa left, Julia looked at the folded napkin from the chapel. "He's not alone," and tucked it carefully into her purse. She kissed her son's knuckles, felt their warm, stubborn life, and stood. The corridor had traded last night's hush for morning's taxicab chatter, wheels of carts, low jokes between night shift and day, the soft clink of breakfast lids. The elevator door sighed open. In the mirrored panel, the woman looking back wasn't beautiful exactly, but there was something lit behind her eyes, like a pilot light had found gas again. The cafeteria hummed with fluorescent hospitality, oatmeal steam, burnt coffee charm. A volunteer in a blue vest arranged bananas like a still life that refused to sit still. At the far end, a small table with a cardboard sign, "Chaplain on duty." No one sat there. Julia bought toast and a coffee that had ambitions it couldn't fulfill. She was halfway to a corner table when a hand lifted from the chaplain desk. Not a hand. Really, just a quiet wave, as if to say no rush. "If you need to not be alone, I'm here." The chaplain was younger than she expected. Maybe mid-30s, sleeves rolled, a tie that had lost the will to be tight. His name tag read A. Gordon. The initials hit her like a bell she couldn't place. "AG, can I—" He began. Julia set the tray down and sat before she could remember to be cautious. "I don't." I'm not here for confessions or advice. She lifted her coffee like a shield. I just need to sit where people remember how to be quiet. That's most of the job, he smiled. He slid a small object across the table, a folded index card. Someone left this on the front pew in the chapel this morning. I thought it might be yours. Her name was on it, Julia, neat, sure handwriting. It wasn't the napkin script. It wasn't any script she recognized from the hospital forms. The room tilted a degree. She looked around as if someone might stand up and say, "Gotcha," but the cafeteria continued its domestic liturgy, spoons in bowls, a toddler refusing a banana, laughter that forgot to be polite. "Who left it?" she asked. Gordon's smile softened. "I opened the chapel at 5:30. It was already there." Her fingers shook. She slipped a nail beneath the card's fold and opened it. "You were never alone, love. Not when you screamed at the sky. Not when you stopped singing. Not when you watched him sleep and decided to do the same, just to keep him company. Grace doesn't wait for you to deserve it. It waits for you to notice it. I am proud of you for staying." The cafeteria dimmed to a pin-drop hush. The M sat there like a candle that knew exactly what it was doing. Matt. Her Matt. The loops in the letters were his, small, stubborn, a little left-leaning, like he was late to everything and trying to catch up. She read it again, tracing the groove of each word with her eyes. The paper smelled like coffee in a pocket. The M looked like it had been underlined by breath. "Is this a joke?" she asked, barely above air. The chaplain shook his head. "Not my style." "My husband's name was Matt," she said, surprised at the steadiness of her voice. "He's been gone 3 years. I'm sorry," Gordon said simply, in a way that didn't feel like surrender. "Do you want me to leave you?" "No." The word came out soft but decisive. "Stay and don't talk." He didn't. They sat, two strangers keeping company with a note that shouldn't exist and did. Julia pressed the card to her chest, as if it could calibrate her heart. Her coffee went cold. She didn't mind. After a while, she folded the card and slid it into her purse beside the napkin. 2 pieces of paper, 2 voices, same sentence. When she stood, the chaplain rose with her. "Whatever that is," he said, nodding toward her bag, "let it be exactly what it is. Not less, not more. What if it was him?" she asked, not sure whether she meant her husband or the one who had stood in the chapel like a question answered. "What if the better question," Gordon said, "is who wanted you to hear it?" She nodded. "Thank you. Come back if you want silence," he said. "Or noise. We do both." On the way to the elevator, the world sharpened, the color of the exit sign, the scuff on the tiles shaped like the state of Ohio, the smell of a cinnamon roll that had seen things. Life had detail again. She felt every pixel. She reached Evan's door and stopped. Through the glass, Nurse Melissa leaned over the bed, speaking softly. Not alarm, but alert. Julia's body moved before her mind could catch up. "What is it?" she asked, breath already failing politely. "Watch," Melissa whispered. Evan's eyelids trembled, the smallest flutter, a moth testing a porch light. His throat moved, his lips parted. "Evan?" Julia said, careful as a lake in winter. She took his hand. "Hey, love. It's Mom. I'm here." His lashes lifted. Not wide, just enough for a sliver of brown to find her. The room collapsed to the distance between that eye and her name. "Mom," he rasped. Dry, a stone skipping once across a pond. Julia's knees went soft. Melissa braced an arm behind her without looking away from the boy. "Easy." "Hi," Julia cried and laughed at once, a sound like water hitting heat. "Hi, sweetheart." Evan's eye closed again. His fingers, those stubborn, piano-resisting fingers, pressed around hers with the intention of a promise. He didn't hold long. He didn't have to. Melissa exhaled the way people do when a prayer lands. "I'll page the team," she said, the professional in her lining up words in a row. This is good." When they were alone, Julia bent over the bed, forehead against her son's hand. "Thank you," she whispered, not to the machines. "Thank you, even if this is only one breath. Thank you because it's this breath." A bird chose that exact second to try a note on the windowsill, as if morning had decided to prove a point. The sound bounced off glass and returned, brighter. Evan slept again, deeper now, not dragged under but carried. Julia sat with him and let the world arrive in waves. Nurses, residents, a flurry of checks that felt like a choreographed dance she trusted. When things calmed, she pulled the chair closer and reached for her bag. She took out the napkin and the index card and laid them side by side on the tray. White and off-white. Block letters and gentle loops. "He's not alone. I am proud of you for staying." Together, they read like a sentence she had been trying to write with her life. She thought of the chapel candle, of the man whose voice carried warmth like a lantern, of the chaplain who knew how to sit without filling the silence with his own importance. She thought of Matt's hands, the way he lined up screws like communion. She thought of how strange it was that love could arrive in lowercase, how it preferred to. The door clicked. A woman stepped in wearing scrubs printed with tiny suns. Older grandmother energy, hair pinned into a style that had never been fashionable and never would be, which is how you know it's right. Her badge said, "Alma." "I'm covering Melissa's break," Alma said. Then her eyes fell on the napkin. "That writing," she murmured almost to herself. "Looks like Marcus." "Marcus?" Julia asked. "Our night shift tech," Alma said, smiling. "He scribbles little encouragements and leaves them places. We tell him he's going to get written up for being kind on company time." Julia held the napkin, torn between relief and something else, something like laughter at how God refuses to stay mystical when a human can carry the line. "So the napkin, probably him," Alma said. "But the timing." She lifted her brows. "That's above my pay grade." Julia looked back at the index card. The M glowed. 2 messengers, one with a time card, one with a signature from another country. Together, they'd said the same truth with different ink. Alma checked the lines with hands that had raised babies and buried elders, and folded towels into perfect thirds. "You're doing good, Mom," she said without looking up. "I'm trying," Julia said. "That's what good is," Alma replied. When Alma left, Julia studied her boy's face. There it was, a hint of him shining through anesthesia's curtain. A miracle? A medical rebound? A body answering a long invitation? Yes, all three. The labels didn't matter. The thank you did. She picked up the index card and flipped it over, just to feel paper move. There in the lower corner, smaller than small, a second line. "Give this to the woman with the tired eyes at bed 412. A friend." The handwriting matched the front, but the instruction, the specificity, felt like someone had walked the hospital in the dark and placed a breadcrumb at the exact corner where she would turn. "Okay," she said into the room, smiling at her own audacity. "I see you. I see all of you." She kissed Evan's forehead and settled back. The fear was still in the room. Fear likes hospitals. It knows the layout, but it had been asked to take a seat. Something else sat in the front row now. Something that kept nudging her shoulder and pointing at the stage. There would be scans. There would be long days and longer nights, and insurance codes that made mercy sound like math. But there would also be this, a hand that had found hers in the dark and decided to hold on. Julia closed her eyes and let the prayer come without words, the way wind moves through trees that still remember how to dance. When she opened them again, the sun had climbed to the lip of the window, throwing a square of warm light across the foot of Evan's bed. His foot twitched. A ballerina's rehearsal of a future step. She laughed out loud, then covered her mouth, startled by the joy of hearing herself. Outside, the city unfurled its faithful noise. Inside, a mother and her son rehearsed breath. On the tray, 2 small papers kept watch. And in the bloodstream of a morning that knew more than it said, something holy kept doing what it always does. Showing up, shy as a sparrow, bold as a sunrise, exactly on time. Days blurred into the kind that refused to call themselves miracles out loud. The monitors no longer dictated every breath. The nurses smiled without checking the clock. Evan opened his eyes more often now, each time staying longer, as if relearning the world in pieces. Sometimes he spoke, sometimes only a whisper. But every sound was music she hadn't realized she'd forgotten the tune to. The doctors called it a remarkable neurological rebound. Julia didn't argue. She'd learned that names didn't change meaning. Whatever it was, it had roots in something larger than medicine. She still carried the napkin and the letter. Both were soft at the corners now, the ink a little smudged, as if handled by someone else too, someone invisible, but not absent. Every morning she read them aloud before her coffee cooled. "He's not alone. Grace doesn't wait for you to deserve it. It waits for you to notice it," and every time she felt the same quiet answer, not in her ears, but behind her ribs. "I'm still here." The road home 2 months later, they let her sign the discharge papers. The nurse handed her a pen, joking, "You've earned honorary residency status." Julia laughed, the sound startlingly light. Evan stood beside her, thinner, slower, but standing. The scar near his temple glowed faintly under the hospital lights like a moon caught in daylight. "You ready?" she asked. He grinned, crooked but certain. "For everything." The elevator ride down felt endless, but when the doors opened onto the lobby's flood of sunlight, Julia had to blink against it. It was too much brightness for someone who'd lived by fluorescent mercy for so long. Outside, traffic hummed. The world didn't look changed, but she had, so the same world behaved differently. She walked slower, breathed deeper, listened better. At the curb, a man in a white maintenance jacket pushed a mop bucket past them. He looked up, nodded politely. "Take care of him," he said. The words were ordinary. The tone wasn't. By the time she turned to thank him, he disappeared into the crowd. Julia smiled, not the surprised kind, but the kind that says, "I understand the language now." The house that waited home smelled like dust and cinnamon. Evan dropped onto the couch, staring at the family photos she'd refused to take down, even when they hurt too much to look at. There was Matt, mid-laugh. Flour on his shirt from the night they'd tried baking bread and invented chaos instead. "I miss him," Evan said quietly. "I do too," Julia replied. She sat beside him, brushing his hair back. "But I think he's been talking the whole time. We just weren't listening right." He looked at her the way children look at grown-ups when they finally realize the grown-ups are guessing too. "Do you really think he sees us?" Julia glanced toward the window, where morning slid across the floor like blessing. "I don't think love forgets its address." They sat together, the silence full, not empty. No thunder, no apparitions, just two survivors sharing oxygen and memory. The call that night, when the house had settled into its new rhythm, Evan asleep in his own bed. Moonlight washing the walls. Julia opened her old phone contacts. One name blinked near the bottom. Daniel. Outreach group. He had been the grief counselor who called months after the accident. She had never answered. The guilt of that ignored call had lived in her bones. Her thumb hovered. Then she pressed call. A sleepy voice answered. "Julia, you okay?" "I think I am," she said, surprised to hear herself mean it. "But I'd like to help. Someone else, maybe. If you know anyone who needs what I needed." A pause. Then warmth. "I always know someone," Julia smiled. "Good, then send them my way." The next morning she started volunteering at the hospital once a week. Not in the ICU, she wasn't ready for that, but in the waiting rooms, the in-between spaces where fear sat on chairs and refused to move. She didn't preach. She didn't hand out verses. She listened. Sometimes she just sat. Sometimes that was enough. The light that stays a year later. On the anniversary of the night, everything changed. Julia and Evan drove down the same stretch of highway that had once divided her life into before and after. Fog hovered again, thin as memory. The clock read 3:14 a.m. She almost laughed at the symmetry. Why this time? Evan asked. "Because this was when Grace found us," she said. They pulled over near the shoulder where she used to imagine angels and accidents traded shifts. The air was cold, the stars too many to count. Evan leaned on the car, quiet. "You really think he was there that night?" Julia watched the horizon. "I think he still is." A single headlight flickered in the distance, a lone car, maybe an Uber carving through fog. For a moment the light seemed to pause, stretch and pass through them instead of by them. Evan blinked. "Did you see?" She nodded. "Yeah, I did." They stood a while longer, saying nothing. The silence wasn't eerie this time. It hummed. When they got back in the car, Julia reached into the glove compartment for tissues and found 2 folded papers she hadn't realized she'd kept there. The napkin, the letter, both had faded, but the words still lived. She placed them on the dashboard where the morning light could touch them. Evan glanced at them, smiling. "Dad's handwriting," he said softly. What does it say again?" Julia read aloud, voice steady. "Grace doesn't wait for you to deserve it. It waits for you to notice it," the boy nodded. "Then I guess we noticed." She looked at him, the same eyes that had once fluttered at the edge of a coma, now shining like they'd been washed clean. "Yeah," she whispered. "We did." The sun broke over the tree line then, washing the car in gold. She didn't close her eyes this time. She let the light hit her full on. The highway stretched ahead, familiar, endless, kind. Julia turned the key. The engine purred. They drove forward, not chasing miracles, but carrying one quietly inside them. Closing line. Because sometimes the miracle isn't that the light returns. It's that this time you stay awake long enough to see it.